In former generations, be woke was a call from the fullness of Christ to the emptiness of man. A call in which he cried, "Awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." In our generation, however, the simplicity and beauty and profundity of that message has been lost. Be woke represents a much more earthly call to an earthly salvation. Of course, we must remember that God is just, and therefore the church that is faithful to God must also and always be faithful to the principles of divine justice. When God's people are spiritually awakened, there are earthly implications. Be woke today, it represents the brokenness of a culture trying to undo itself and remake itself into the identity of a new ideological supergroup, new oppressors, championing a new meta-narrative. Indeed, in our own day, there is an ironic Orwellianism. In the name of inclusion, we exclude. In the name of tolerance, we cancel. In the name of peace, we incite violence. In the name of anti-racism, we erect a new apartheid, one every bit as hateful as the old. And in the greatest irony of all, anyone who dares to dream a dream of a different tomorrow is labelled, segregated, silenced, and banished. It's like we woke up in a bad dream. In a culture that has lost a vision of God and lost, therefore, any transcendent foundation for its virtue, it should not be surprising that it's losing its ability to define human identity and dignity and responsibility, even the true meaning of history itself. And from such a perspective, what is life? What is the meaning of history? Shakespeare put it best, didn't he? Life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's what history is all about in the mindset of modern man, bereft of truth. History is a tale of power plays where the strong oppress the weak and the rich oppress the poor and the majority oppress the minority. And from such a perspective, redemption comes not through Christ, who was rich and yet for our sakes became poor, that we through his poverty might become rich. No, redemption comes when the oppressed rise up and impose their liberty and their equality and their fraternity upon the rich for their own ends and for their own pleasure. And so when you detach liberty, equality and fraternity from truth, transcendent truth, what you're always left with is brutality and more oppression. As the French said in their revolution, we've strangled the last king by the guts of the last priest. C.S. Lewis captures this aimless quest for justice without truth. Lead us, evolution, lead us up the future's endless stair. Chop us, change us, prod us, weed us. For stagnation is despair. Groping, guessing, yet progressing. Lead us, nobody knows where. Far too long have sages vainly glossed great nature's simple text. He who runs can read it plainly. Goodness equals what comes next. In a world in which evolution is the governing ethos, how are we to find the high moral ground to condemn the strong from doing what they plainly evolved to do, which is to weed out the weak? Is that not evolution's way, where nature is red in tooth and claw? When the church buys into that thinking, when the church allows the world to dictate its mission, it'll not be very long before the world also dictates and changes the church's message. And we have the preaching of a social gospel, bereft of any eternal value. No, the church's mission is not to change a culture. The church's mission is to change sinners by giving them the gospel, a gospel that calls them to turn from sin and to God. And when the church gets that message right, when the church faithfully practices God's extraordinarily ordinary means of grace, the preaching of the word, prayer and the sacraments, when the church gets that message right and stays on focus and on message in that regard, then she has the power to truly change a culture, one repentant sinner at a time. That happened back in my homeland, back in Northern Ireland, in the 20s, when a young preacher, W.P. Nicholson, began preaching the gospel. Here's a man who preached with the authority of God and the felt sense of eternity, righteousness, judgment to come. He preached as if there was a heaven to gain and a hell to lose. And a sense of the glory of God gripped him. And when he preached, a whole city was turned from darkness to light. Public houses closed across the city. And in the Harland and Wolff shipyards, where my fellow countrymen built the Titanic, perhaps not our finest hour, the management had to open a massive hangar, a warehouse. They called it the Nicholson Shed because people were bringing back so many stolen tools. They were awoken. And the church effected that change not by practicing a stolen tool repatriation society, but by preaching the simple gospel in the power of God's Holy Spirit. To be woke, in the classical Christian sense, is to wake up to spiritual life so that we can be awakened to spiritual discernment, having eyes to see and ears to hear, to know that while we were blind, now we see, and to be awakened to a sense of spiritual vision, knowing how the gospel helps set people oppressed by sin, people like you and me, how the gospel sets us free. And to stand steadfast in the love of God that is stronger than death, and in the faith once delivered for all to the saints, and to heed the call to be awoken to the everlasting glories of the living Christ. That's the kind of woke that the church on earth, moving toward her triumph in heaven, that's the kind of woke the bride of Christ is to be.